Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cops and Cons TV. This is our live show. I just wanted to welcome everyone to the show. So we have actually taken a couple weeks off, so I kind of want to remind everyone what we're going to be doing today. So over the last couple weeks, there's been some really interesting police cases, and we're just going to talk about those. So essentially, we're going to just break down some of the most important issues and cases in policing. While I'm going through and talking about these cases, I definitely like some feedback. So if you have any comments or any questions about the cases we're going through or some of the related issues, definitely put those in the chat and we can get to those comments as well. And again, my name is Daniel. This is Cops and Cons TV. We do this live show just about every Friday. So we have taken the last couple Fridays off, and one of the reasons for that is, I don't know if you can tell, but I have a broken nose. I was trail running a couple weeks ago and I tripped on a rock. I fell and I smashed my face. So my nose is still broken, but it is in a lot better shape than it was. If you want to see a video of how horrible and crazy I looked from right after it happened, you can go to my YouTube or TikTok at Police Law News, and you can see a video of when it happened there. Anyways, but right before we get into the cases, I just want to welcome everybody in. It looks like we have some people from California, from Poland, from Florida. So it is Sergeant George, get better soon. Thank you, I am better. So real quick, this happened about just about 2.5 weeks ago, and then last weekend I did run a half marathon trail race out of state. So I think I'm completely recovered, even though my nose still looks a little bit crazy. So I just want to welcome everybody in. If you haven't already, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel, Cops and Cons TV, just so you know exactly when we're going to be doing these live shows. Also, any comments that you leave, if it's a case that maybe we didn't get to this week, might be something that we can cover next week. So definitely make sure that you subscribe to the channel and watch all of our videos that we put out. So again, welcome in, and I just want to get right into it because I'm so excited about this because we have taken a couple weeks off. So the first case that I want to get into, and I do this every time we do this, that almost every week there is one just really big and major police case that we really have to talk about. And this case happened on 10/12, so just pretty recently in San Antonio, Texas. And I think everyone knows who kind of follows this about exactly which case this is. So this happened in San Antonio, Texas. This was a rookie police officer. So there was a call for service at a McDonald's in reference to some kind of a disturbance at the McDonald's restaurant. While the officer was there, and this is nighttime, he sees a vehicle that's parked in the parking lot. Nothing strange about it, but the officer recognizes that vehicle, or he at least thinks it's a vehicle that had run from him or fled from a traffic stop very recently or the night before. So what the officer does is, the first thing he does is correct. He calls out over the radio. So he lets dispatch know that, that what he was on. So he was on this disturbance call, but he let dispatch know that he was going to make contact with this other vehicle that he at least thought fled from him at a traffic stop, and he did ask for a backup officer. So a lot of times, unless it looks like someone is in immediate danger, this is one of those things where a lot of times the best thing that police officers can do and what they're trained to do is to wait for the backup to actually get there. However, this officer didn't do that. So the vehicle was parked. Before backup got there, he went and he approached the driver's side of the car. Now at this point, we always talk about decision points that police officers have. So at this point, the officer had a couple decisions to make. Should he knock on the door? Should he knock on the window? Should he announce himself that he's a San Antonio police officer? All of those things are different things that police officers should do in an ideal situation, because you want an individual that you're talking to know that you're a police officer. I mean, that makes sense. If you're going to give, as an officer, if you're going to give a lawful command to someone, well, they have to know that you have the authority to do that. One of those ways to let them know you have that authority is say, I'm Officer Blank with the San Antonio Police Department. So this officer doesn't do that. He doesn't knock on the door either. He walks up to the car door and he tries the handle, and he just opens the door. As he opens the door, there's a 17-year-old named Eric Cantu, and there's also a female passenger in the front seat, but a 17-year-old named Eric is seated in the front seat of the vehicle, and he's eating a McDonald's hamburger. You can see the look on his face when the car door opens that he's just surprised. One, he's surprised that someone is opening his car door, and he's probably surprised that it's someone who's a police officer. The officer never identifies himself as a police officer, so it's unknown if it's unknown what's going on in Eric's mind. But if we we a lot of times in these situations, I always say, like, let's put yourself in the position of a reasonable police officer. Well, we also have to put ourselves in the position of just a regular civilian who is living their life, eating their McDonald's hamburger, who in a parking lot, unexpectedly, their door opens and someone starts yelling commands at them. So in the moment, did he think it was a security guard? Did he think it was an enemy? Did he know it was a police officer? So these are all questions that we should be asking that honestly, we just don't know the answers to, but it's an interesting thought experiment to kind of go through what are some of the thought processes that Eric might have had. So once the officer opens the door, he basically just gives him a command right away to step out of the vehicle or exit. Almost immediately, while the door is still, the driver's side door is open, Eric puts the car in reverse. Well, because the door was opened and because the police officer was standing pretty much in the doorway, the door did strike the police officer as Eric reversed. Now, this is a couple things. So this is not Eric, the driver of not trying to defend his actions, because you should, if he knew it was a police officer, you obviously should not flee from a police officer. That's illegal. So that's not something that someone should do if you know it's a police officer. But Eric at this point did not seem like he was trying to intentionally hit the police officer. It seems like the police officer being struck by the door is just because the door happened to be open, not because Eric opened the door himself and was trying to use that as a weapon against the police officer. But again, if we go in the mind of the police officer in the moment, here you are trying to contact someone that you believe had already fled, and how it happened, you know, we can look back in 2020 hindsight. No matter how it happened, you're struck with a door from a moving vehicle, which absolutely 100% could cause injury. So the vehicle reverses, you know, maybe 15 feet or so, and then stops. Once the vehicle stops, and the vehicle reverses, it's facing in the opposite direction. So essentially, it's not like pointed towards the officer, but it's facing straight like it's going to leave. It reverses and then it looks like it's going to go in the opposite direction of where the officer was. However, at that point, the police officer fires 5 rounds at the driver of the vehicle. The vehicle then actually starts to move and starts to speed away. So now the vehicle is still in the McDonald's parking lot, driving away from the officer. So at this point, the officer is absolutely not in any danger because the vehicle is literally moving in the opposite direction of him. The officer fires 5 more rounds into the vehicle. I believe the officer shot 10 rounds total. The vehicle, other officers were able to, the officer did call out over the air that there were shots fired, and the officer, or the vehicle eventually crashed, and Eric was scooped up by ambulance. He is still alive. However, he obviously has some very serious injuries, and his attorney said that he's clinging to life. The female passenger, thankfully, was not shot at all. So a couple things happen with this officer. So a lot of times when there's an officer-involved shooting, you know, there's an investigation. The police, not just a criminal investigation, but an administrative investigation where the department collects all their evidence. They have internal affairs look at things. They interview witnesses. They go over body cam. And this process, you know, could take several months. However, sometimes when there are really significant police issues or cases where the community is in an uproar, that process is kind of avoided. And the city or police department goes around that, and that's what happened here. So the police officer was terminated, and also he was charged by the district attorney with 2 charges of aggravated assault. They did 2 charges of aggravated assault because there were actually 2 people in the vehicle. So the officer did turn himself in, and he was charged with those charges formally. Now, a couple things about this is, you know, it's been reported in the news that the San Antonio, we saw a news report from CNN and a couple other places that made a point to say that the police union is not backing the officer. And whenever you hear something like that, you go, well, that's strange. And the reason you would think that's strange is not because police unions are bad, but because police unions, it's literally their job to represent someone, to represent police officers. Like, they don't have a choice. And typically police unions, when they do represent someone, especially if someone's accused of a crime, they don't get to pick and choose which officers that they want to represent. They have to. It just if they don't, then their certification as a union could be in jeopardy, or they could be sued. So it's when the news says, you know, the police union isn't backing this officer, they say it in a way which makes it sound like this is so horrible, this is so terrible, even without doing a full investigation, like no one is supporting this officer. Well, what they leave out of that, and what I think is really important to know, is that this officer was a rookie officer. So, and you actually, in the city of San Antonio, and actually in a lot lot of different police departments under collective bargaining laws, you actually don't have union protection, full union rights until you're past your probationary period. So essentially until you're on 1 year or more and you're not a rookie. So it's not that the police union is not backing this officer or representing him because his actions were so horrible. They might be horrible, but that isn't the reason. The reason is because any police officer who's a rookie just hasn't met the level, the standard of having 1 year on where you get union benefits. So I think that's important. So I'm curious if anybody has any questions about this case or any different thoughts on it, and then I'm gonna go over some of my thoughts on this case. Let's see, Sergeant George, it's always the golden rule that you announce yourself as a police officer. That is absolutely correct. And thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's just like what I said. If you're a police officer, I always say that, we want people to follow what police officers say, because if you don't follow the commands of a police officer, that's when situations can go into a use of force. That's when someone could get injured or killed. And the goal of all of this should be, how can we make it so there is less violence between citizens and police? Even if a police officer makes a mistake or does something wrong, we have civil courts for that. We have internal affairs for that. So the time to do that isn't in the time to object to a police officer making a mistake, which they do make. The time to object to that mistake isn't in a bare knuckle brawl on the street with a police officer. So I always preach that, yes, we want people to follow the commands of police officers. Again, if the police officers did something illegal, sue them later on. There are thousands of attorneys who would be happy to help you with that, and you absolutely should. But from the point of a police officer, if you're not announcing yourself as a police officer, it's really difficult to expect people to follow what you say. If you don't say, I'm a police officer with the San Antonio Police Department, so you're giving someone commands, but you're not letting them know what that authority is. And especially if there was a situation that happened quick. Again, just imagine you're eating in a McDonald's parking lot. All of a sudden, a door opens up, and within a second, someone's shouting commands. I always talk about how the human brain for a police officer or for anyone just can't process information that fast, and that, especially under stress, there are absolute reasonable scientific limits to human performance. Well, as I've said before, that isn't just for police officers, that's for everybody. So in a situation like that, Eric, who is sitting in the driver's seat of the vehicle, the stress that he must have been under, not even probably knowing that this was a police officer, not expecting it, the action that he took in the moment of reversing and trying to get out of the situation, it might not be that unreasonable. Now, had the officer knocked on the door and said, San Antonio Police Department, I would be having an entire different discussion. Doesn't mean that the shooting would be lawful or reasonable or justified, but at least the lawful command, at least we can make an argument, okay, he at least let the individual know who he was. So, a couple things about this. So, San Antonio Police Department does have some use of force policies. They have a lot of use of force policies, which all good police departments do. A couple of those policies have to do with shooting at or from a motor vehicle. And this is how the San Antonio Police Department was essentially able to fire this officer so quickly based on saying he violated these policies, and he probably did. So let's talk about a couple of those policies. One of the policies that the San Antonio Police Department has, and this is actually a very common policy that they have, is that you cannot shoot at a moving vehicle to disable the vehicle. Meaning that if a car is moving, no matter what direction it's going, and you want to stop that car, one of the ways to do that cannot be shooting at it. You can't shoot at the tires, you can't shoot at the engine block. If your goal is to just stop the movement of the car, absolutely can't do that. That's a violation of police department policy. Whatever their sanction is, it's probably, shooting at a vehicle when you're not supposed to. It's probably a pretty high sanction where an individual officer could be fired for that. So it looks like he probably violated that policy because, again, he shot at the vehicle as it was driving away, which doesn't make any sense. Also, there's another policy that's really very common in police departments, is that if a vehicle is moving towards you, so if you think that you are going to be struck by a vehicle as a police officer, if you have a way to move out of the way, you have to do that first. So you have to first try to avoid the vehicle if possible. And then you can only use deadly force against an occupant of a vehicle if there's nothing else that you can do. Here's an example of that. Let's say that a police officer is pulled over on the side of the road, they're on the highway, and they are on a traffic stop, okay? As they're on a traffic stop, maybe they're standing behind their trunk getting a new ticket book, or who knows what they could be doing. While they're standing on, or maybe they're even talking to the driver. While they're talking to a driver, a random vehicle that's also on the highway just comes out of nowhere, just careening towards them, totally out of control. In the moment, when a car's coming fast and there's nothing else you could do, that might be a situation where an officer might be able to pull out their firearm and shoot at that vehicle in order to get it to stop. Now, who knows how effective that would be? Probably not that effective if it's moving that fast close to you, but that would be a situation where there's at least some wiggle room about when a police officer can actually shoot at a vehicle. However, this is not one of those cases. It's not like police officers have like a stand your ground rule. Well, because I'm supposed to be here, I can stand here. I don't have to move. I can just shoot you. Like, that just isn't a thing with police department policy. So those are the couple of the different policies it looked like he violated. Let's see. When it comes to officer-involved shootings, not only do you have people trying to file lawsuits, but you have the news media that covers those moments. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Targeted patent. I agree. Awesome. Thank you so much for agreeing. So those are some of my thoughts. So it looks like the officer likely violated police department policy, and it does look like criminal charges are probably reasonable. Now, whether he's guilty or not, beyond a reasonable doubt, there's so much more information and evidence that we would have to hear to see if that is the case or not. So we'll have to see what the trial process and the court process looks like. But when we come to, was there probable cause to charge the officer with aggravated assault? There's probably enough probable cause for that. So this does not look, just in basic, just layman terms, this does not look like a good officer-involved shooting. We have to look at what is the lawful objective. What was the police officer trying to do? At the time that the police officer shot the vehicle, it just doesn't seem like he was in any immediate danger at that point. So those are some of my thoughts on that case. It's been all over the news. That's probably the biggest, most controversial police officer-involved shooting that we have. Let's see. So the next case that I want to talk about happened in Bernalillo County, New Mexico. And also for the last video and for this video, we do have links to some of the body cam and dash cam footage. So we'll definitely put those in the chat if you want to check those out. So you can kind of see exactly what we're talking about later on. So this next case happened in Bernalillo County, New Mexico, and this happened at the end of September. So this happened on September 20th of this year. And if you know anything about Bernalillo County, New Mexico, just think Breaking Bad. Just think Breaking Bad. That is a really good example of Bernalillo County, New Mexico. So deputies with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office were dispatched to a gas station. This was on day shift. It was light outside. They were dispatched to a gas station in reference to a call for service. So here's some of the remarks on this call for service. It's that someone called in and said there's an individual, he's inside of a vehicle at a gas pump, he's in the driver's seat, he looks intoxicated, and he's passed out. So that's the reason the police officers were called in the first place. And I also always talk about lawful objective, okay? So it's like, yes, they're a lawful objective, basically the reason why police officers are doing something. If there's no lawful objective for what police officers are doing, then if they have to use force later on, I just don't have a whole lot of sympathy for that. So lawful objective is the most important thing. So our police officers doing something that they should be doing under the law. So so they're called to this. Once they get there, they contact the driver in the vehicle. And I don't know what it is about people who are drunk in vehicles who are woken up by police where they just have this instinct to fight and run. But this guy, 45-year-old Colby Atkins, yeah, he had the instinct to fight and run. So what Mr. Atkins did during contact with police officers once they woke him up is he fled from the scene. So he drove away at an extremely high rate of speed and started driving crazy on the wrong side of the road, high rates of speed through pretty heavy traffic during the day. So at this point, the police officers, well, they have a choice. So, I mean, the question really is should they chase the vehicle or not? Now, when police officers get involved in vehicle pursuits, not only do they have to think about state law, but they also have to think about department policy. So there was a Bernalillo County Sheriff's deputy chief who did give a statement to the media, and he said, our mandate, just from a protection standpoint, first and foremost, is to protect the innocent public. So that's, it sounds like that the leadership there, at least this leader from the department, is supporting the police officers in this case. The police officers have to have the decision about whether or not they actually chase the vehicle or not. Now, when there's police pursuits are one of the most dangerous thing that police officers can do, not just for the person who's running, not just for the officer, but for everybody else who's in the road. Pedestrians, people driving their kids to and from school, people going to the grocery store, just regular people who have nothing to do with the police incident. So as he's driving crazy, the police officers, the deputies do decide to chase him. It like happens in most chases, the bad guy crashes. And especially in cases like this, where someone is drunk or high, yeah, it's not too long before the individual's gonna crash. And that's what absolutely happened. Mr. Adkins, he crashed his vehicle, and police officers then, in this case, they did the right thing. So there is a tendency from police officers, especially if the training isn't that great, is once a vehicle crashes that you get like 10 different cops running up to the car and they're pulling on door handles. But the officers didn't do that. They kept their distance from Mr. Adkins, and they used their vehicles for cover and some concealment, which is tactically absolutely the best thing to do. So I want to definitely point that out, that was a good decision by the police officers, not just run up and try to rip him out of the car. That what they tried to do is from a distance, a safe distance, they tried to yell at him and give him verbal commands to comply. So this is a good thing, because the police officers in cases like this, they're showing, hey, we're not looking to just run up and thunder this guy. Like, we want to give him commands, follow those commands, and then we don't have to use force. So this shows what the intent, the mindset of the officers are, which is a good thing. So I want to commend the officers on that. So, but what Mr. Adkins does, he then exits the vehicle and he picks up a flashlight. He's not listening to police officers, he's not following commands, he's kind of walking in and around his vehicle, but again, not doing what they're asking him to do. Then he picks up a flashlight. So you can see it in the video that we link there, but it's essentially a flashlight. It's a long, black, thin flashlight, you know, maybe be 8 or 9 inches long or so. And what he does, he holds it like a gun and he stands in a shooting platform. What that means is basically he's standing like he's shooting a gun. So he's not holding it out like a flashlight, he's not holding it out like he's using it as like an umbrella. Like, he's holding it like it's a gun. And he's pointing it out, holding it like it's a gun, and he's pointing it at passing vehicles. So in the moment, the deputies there were 6 of them on scene, they thought that he was holding a gun. So, I mean, so we have to ask ourselves, well, is it reasonable that the deputies thought that he was holding a gun? Okay, so what do we know about Mr. Adkins? Well, we know that he's someone who's going to flee from police officers, drive recklessly, and put everybody else on the road in danger. So the police officers already know this is the kind of person he is, because these are the actions we just saw him do. Then, and I do believe he has a prior conviction for a federal conviction for bank robbery, though the officers at the time didn't know that. Okay, so he points this at passing vehicles. Was it reasonable for the deputies to think that this was a firearm? And it likely was, because of the shape. He had the intent for police officers to think that he was holding a firearm, pointing at other vehicles. Why would someone think that? Because they would have to know that a reasonable response from police officers would be to shoot at him and kill him. So that would be a reasonable response. If you're trying to elicit actions from police, this is the kind of thing that you would do. So police officers, the 6 officers did shoot at him a little over a dozen times, and he was shot and killed. So I'll definitely look to see if there's any comments about this case or any thoughts about this case. But you know, he did have a flashlight, he didn't have a firearm, but that is when it comes to whether or not an officer involved shooting is reasonable and legal, it isn't about if the individual actually had a gun, it's would a reasonable officer in the moment believe that Mr. Adkins had a gun? Is this how a reasonable officer would have acted in a situation like this? That's basically the standard that you're going to find in Graham versus Connor, the reasonable officer standard. So was it reasonable for the police officers to think this? So if anybody thinks that it wasn't reasonable for the police officer to think this, I'd love to hear your comments and see why. So the only other thing the police officers could have done, if they honestly believe that it's a firearm, is to wait for him to start shooting random people, and then how many lives are you going to sacrifice before you act as a police officer? So to me, this seems like and he was pointing it at, he wasn't just pointing the flashlight at like randomly around, like there was a random person who was driving in like this big van, and he was pointing it right at the van. So really, as soon as it seemed to the officers like he picked out a victim and was pointing it right there, and the police officers had to make a split-second decision, not based on 20/20 hindsight and the luxury and in the privilege of your own home watching these videos, but in the moment, this is the life and death decision that they had to make, and and it likely was a reasonable decision. Unlike the first case we did, this seems like this officer-involved shooting was a reasonable, lawful officer-involved shooting, though we will keep following this case to see if there are going to be any discipline or charges for the police officers. However, with the available evidence we have now, it seems like this was a lack of a better term, a good officer-involved shooting. So any other comments on that? We'll go ahead and go. I'll talk about those. But the next case that I want to talk about, this is a tragic case. I hate covering cases like this, but it happened in Greenville, Mississippi. This was a police officer who was shot and killed. This was a couple days ago. It was on October 11th. Her name was Maisha Stewart, and she was a detective with the Greenville Police Department. Reading a little bit about her background, she was a native of Greenville. That's where she came from. So, she was a police detective in her own department. And they haven't released a whole lot of information about this case. The department has been pretty hush-hush on it, but here's the information that we have so far that's been made publicly available, at least up through this morning, is that there was a call for service reference a disturbance. Now, they haven't gone into exactly what kind of disturbance it was, but it did elicit the response from several police officers, including Miss Stewart, who was a detective with the police department. Police officers got there, and the report is that the officers had a shootout with multiple different subjects. The report is that not only was Officer Stewart killed in the gunfire, but that other police officers were also, and other individuals were also injured in this shooting, and that they do have the offender in custody. So we will keep following this case, but Detective Stewart did have a 3-year-old child, so it's a really sad case. We've actually had a lot of officers shot recently. This has been an especially violent week for law enforcement, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of these cases, even though, again, I do not like talking about these kind of cases, but I think it's important to get it out there, because a lot of times these stories are very popular local stories, and they don't make it onto the national level. So because here at Cops and Con TV, we have a pretty big audience, so I think some of these stories, even though I don't like talking about them, they should be national stories, not just local stories. That goes into the next one. It was an officer-involved shooting in Bristol, Connecticut. Again, this happened a couple days ago on October 13th, and again, it's the same kind of thing. So this violence against police officers has been pretty awful lately. So police officers were dispatched to a domestic disturbance in Bristol, Connecticut. And the only way that Bristol, Connecticut, what I think about is ESPN. I'm pretty sure that's the headquarters of ESPN. So I think it's a pretty reasonable area. I don't think it's high crime or anything like that. But anyways, it was a domestic disturbance that they were dispatched to between two brothers. 3 different police officers went. As the police officers went, really before they could make contact with anyone, there was an individual who was waiting to ambush police officers, who was armed with a rifle, and essentially ambushed the police officers and shot at them as they were walking to the call for service. It seems like, at least at first, they didn't even have a chance to respond or to know what happened. Sergeant Dustin DeMonte was killed. Officer Alex Hamzy was also killed by the gunman, and a third officer, Alec Iurato. Irato, I'm not going to say his name right, but he was injured. His injuries, they said that it's a significant injury, significant wound. However, he is still alive. The suspect in question, his name is Nicholas Butcher. He died on scene, and also I guess his brother was also on scene. Though his brother was also on scene, and he was shot by police officers as well. The Connecticut government, Ned Lamont, said that the shootings of the police officers was a senseless tragedy. So this has been a huge story in Connecticut, and it is making some national news. But I mean, the idea was that so we don't know what the motive is yet. The offender, Nicholas, he's been described as neighbors as a divorced dad of a couple kids who liked to drink beer and was kind of like a loud guy who loved guns. Other people said that he was like a fun-loving guy. So it's difficult to know what the motive is, or why someone would just decide one day to just randomly attack police officers. Again, this wasn't like the police officers were there, they were trying to place him under arrest. I mean, it seems like the information we're getting now is that the call was placed by the offender in order to lure police officers there and then pick them off as they were just responding to a call for service, which is pretty evil to do. the FOP, so the Fraternal Order of Police, has made a couple public statements recently about all this violence towards police officers. So the FOP noted that since Monday, so here we are Friday, that since Monday that there's been 12 police officers. This was as of yesterday, so I don't know what happened last night in the country, but there's been 12 police officers around the country that have been shot since Monday, and the FOP is blaming the culture of lawlessness. So we'll have to see what some of the motives are for these shootings, but 12 police officers shot in a 4-day period is absolutely insane. So those are some of the most important, I think, police officer cases or that have made the news that I think are just important to talk about, because not all of these cases, like I always say, it's not just one individual case, because a lot of these cases, they have issues embedded in them that are going to just branch out to other police cases. Like, this isn't the only time that we're going to talk about an officer-involved shooting where an officer is shooting at a vehicle. So to kind of learn or talk about some like the bigger picture issues and then policies and procedures behind some of these issues are good, because the goal is, let's say, like that first case that we covered in San Antonio. Let's just say that the officer did make a mistake, that it was a bad officer-involved shooting. Well, what can we learn from that? So what can police departments put in training, can put in education for police officers so that doesn't happen again? Because that's really the goal of all this. What can we do so there is less violence between citizens and police officers? So police officers still have an important job to do, but how can they do that safely, not just for themselves, but also for the public? So this is the main police case I want to talk about. I also want to talk about some things that are happening in some really interesting court cases lately that, I don't know if anybody follows Law and Crime, the channel from Dan Abrams, but they do a lot of good analysis on and just live video of trials, and I almost watch that stuff more than I watch police body cam video. But a couple things that people might be interested in. So Alex Jones was sued by the families of the children who were killed in the Sandy Hook shooting. So Alex Jones, if everybody remembers, he's from InfoWars. He went on back when this happened, 2013, 12, a decade ago, basically saying that the Sandy Hook shooting was a hoax, that it didn't happen. He claimed that the parents were actors. They didn't lose their kids. I remember when this happened, and it's absolutely insane that he was saying these things. So eventually, he was sued. It's taken, again, almost a decade or so. He was sued, and he lost his civil the lawsuits against him. He just lost a pretty big case. So a couple days ago, it came down that the civil judgment against Alex Jones is $965 million. And this isn't the only case. I think a couple weeks ago, he lost another case for like $40 million or so. And I think there's at least one more pending. So, almost $1 billion. So this is just about the only lawsuit like this, the biggest civil defamation lawsuit ever, $900, which is an absolute crazy amount of money. Now, one of the important things that reasonable people are going to ask is, well, is he actually going to pay this? Like, is he actually going to pay this amount? So in short, no, he's not, because he doesn't have $965 million. So the parent company of his show InfoWars is called like Free Speech Coalition or something like that. So they filed for bankruptcy. It's very possible that Alex Jones himself may even file for bankruptcy as well. And maybe some of the lawsuits could be dissolved there, where he wouldn't have to pay all of them or a smaller amount. But I've seen some analysis on, well, how much money does Alex Jones actually have? So, again, you can't really trust anything even though he's right every now and then, you can't trust anything he says, because he just says absolutely crazy things. But Alex Jones has said publicly that he only has about $2 million to his name. Well, there's been an analysis done by, I believe, Forbes, who looked at all of the companies that he owns, and they said that his actual net worth, if you can include all of the company he owns like a vitamin supplement nonsense company too, that he's worth somewhere between $130 and $270 million. So that seems like an absolute lot of money, but even with all of his assets, even at the highest level, it's nowhere near $965 million. So he will likely not ever pay that amount. Let's say that Alex Jones goes through bankruptcy court. So let's say he goes through bankruptcy. Well, a lot of times civil judgments are basically, it seems like anything except student loans you can dissolve through the bankruptcy process. But there's one thing about defamation cases. So if during the bankruptcy process, if there's and I don't know the exact language, I just know the main tenets of it, that is that if you can show that what the individual did for the defamation was malicious or had malice attached to it, well, anything with malice is not going to be dissolved in bankruptcy court. So let's say he files for personal bankruptcy and tries to get all of this dissolved there. If they're able to show that there was malice behind it, it may not do anything for this civil judgment. But Alex Jones doesn't have anywhere near $965 million. One of the interesting things is that as the verdict was read, he was actually doing a live show on InfoWars about it and pretty much mocking the jury and the judge and making jokes about it as the verdict was being read. So it's interesting that, he's still trying to raise money for his legal defense. The other case that just came out is Nikolas Cruz. So Nikolas Cruz, he was the offender in the Parkland shooting that happened in Florida. Guilt or innocence, he's guilty. That's already been determined. So what we had going on last week and this week was essentially the sentencing. And what this came down to, well, was the jury going to find that Nikolas Cruz, the offender, was going to be life in prison, or was he going to get the death penalty? So it came out yesterday that Nikolas Cruz is not going to get the death penalty, that he is going to get life in prison. And one of the reasons for that, so there are 12 jurors, and essentially any decision for the death penalty has to be a unanimous decision. So what the jurors said is that there was one holdout. So essentially it was 11-1, and the one person kept Nikolas Cruz alive and on this planet, and not to get the death penalty. So with that, Governor DeSantis, he did go on the news and he did say, he expressed his disappointment with that one juror held it up. A lot of politicians are also saying the same thing. The DA said the same thing. And really more importantly than any of the politicians who are kind of talking about this case are the family of the victims. Almost all of the family of the victims who've been speaking public about this case wanted Nikolas Cruz to face the death penalty. In cases like this, I always defer to what does the victim want? What does the family want? And I put a lot of weight on what they want as long as it's something legal. Nikolas Cruz getting the death penalty absolutely would have been a legal thing, but there was one holdout, so he will face life in prison. One of the last case I want to talk about, and I don't know how much people are following this, but it's a really interesting case. It's the Waukesha killer, Darrell Brooks. So this is the individual who drove his car through Waukesha, his SUV in Waukesha, Wisconsin during a Christmas parade last year, just drove it through. He killed, I think, 6 different people. I can't remember the exact number. I think he killed at least 6 people, injured dozens more. This was a Christmas parade that was going on through Wisconsin. The main thing people remember about this is there was a group of women called the Dancing Grannies, and he pretty much plowed through them and caused injury and killed a couple women associated with that group as well. Anyway, so he's charged with all kinds of homicide charges. 6 people were killed and 62 were injured in the Waukesha killing. And Darrell Brooks, so obviously he has some mental health issues, but he has been found competent to stand trial. So what's important to know is that he wanted to represent himself, and he is. So there was all kinds of different legal processes and all kinds of different things in order to get the court to allow him to do it. It's one of those things where if you can show that you're competent, and a judge doesn't let you do it after whatever legal challenges and things that you have to meet. It's one of those things where if you lose, which you'll probably lose in court and be found guilty, that's an issue that can be appealed. So, even though judges know it's a bad idea, everybody knows it's a bad idea, and this individual has obvious mental health issues, it's one of those things where if he really wants to do it, you kind of have to let him. So he's been representing himself, and this thing is just a circus. So here's some highlights from Darrell Brooks, from Darrell Brooks' case. So there's been multiple times where he gets into shouting matches with the judge, and even though he's representing himself in his own trial, he's actually removed from the courtroom and put into another room where he could watch on camera because he's just not acting like a reasonable person in court. He's screaming and yelling and talking over the judge and interrupting people. One of the times he did this when he was put in this other room, he took off his shirt, he took off his clothes, and he's walking around. At one point he had a suit jacket on, he put the suit jacket over his head and he's looking around at people. So it's absolutely it's absolutely crazy, some things that are going on. He also mouthed under his mask when a dance instructor was testifying. He's whispering things to the jury. One of the strangest things he did is last week he claimed that one of the jurors gave him the finger as he walked in, and they had to have a whole hearing about this. And it's one of those things where it's like the judge has to give some credibility to this and do some type of investigation, or judges do some type of hearing on it, because if they just ignore it, these are issues that if he does get a competent appellate attorney later on, that they can appeal some of these issues. So they had to question the jurors, see if the juror's biased, and obviously the juror did not give Mr. Brooks the finger as he walked in. Also, Mr. Brooks, one of the witnesses called him Mr. Brooks, called him Darrell Brooks, called him by his name, and then he says that he doesn't identify as Darrell Brooks anymore. So he didn't say what he does identify as, but he definitely doesn't identify as Darrell Brooks anymore. So if he doesn't identify anymore as Darrell Brooks, then should he be responsible for the crimes that Darrell Brooks committed? So that's a reasonable question. Yeah, so that's an interesting case. He also shaved his head. He had dreadlocks before, and he shaved his head. And he was questioning one of the police officers who was on scene, and he was saying, well, didn't the individual who do this have like long hair? And I have a shaved head. And the officer was like, yes, since this happened, you have shaved your head. So really strange case. So that's the last case the last court case that I wanted to talk about. One other thing that's kind of like as a side note is I just want to do a little bit about Hunter Biden. So Hunter Biden has been under investigation, and it looks like there are two possible charges that Hunter Biden might face. One is tax evasion, and the other one is it has to do with putting incorrect or false information on a firearm, a federal firearm form. Essentially, what this comes down to is when you purchase a firearm, you have to fill out these federal forms, and one of them says something to the effect of like you aren't addicted to any illegal narcotics or substances. Well, he put no, so he was able to purchase the firearm, but since then he's come out publicly, he's written a book, and all kinds of information that you really can't dispute, where he says, I was addicted to drugs, I was a drug addict from this year to this year. Well, in that time period happens to be when he filled out this federal firearm form. Because he was addicted to the drugs, I'm sure he did not even remember that question was on there. So that's one of the charges there. So a couple things. So it seems like the Democrats really just don't care about the charges. Even people who are concerned about gun control, this is usually the kind of thing that gun control advocates, really want to go after, people lying on federal firearm forms, but they don't really care about that. All the Democrats seem to care about is just, making sure this doesn't attach to or any way hurt Joe Biden. Republicans, it seems like the Republicans don't really care about the tax evasion or the federal firearm stuff either. Really, all they care about is the higher level crimes that might have been committed. What they say is that we know when Joe Biden was president, that Hunter Biden had all of these business dealings in Ukraine with energy companies and in China, where he was basically flying around the country picking up bags of cash using the Biden name and trading that for influence. Again, while he was an admitted drug addict. So that's some of the issues around there. But those are some of the possible charges he might face. At least from the Republican side, what they're saying, what they're concerned is that that they're going to go after Hunter for tax evasion and this firearm form nonsense. And basically it's up to the lead prosecutor in Delaware to see if he's going to face charges on these, and is to charge him with some of these crimes, and then then be able to say something to the effect of, well, see, we aren't giving him special treatment, we went after him. Well, that isn't what the Republicans want. They want the higher level government corruption. They want that to be investigated. So we'll see what happens there, but it does look like charges could be coming soon, the tax evasion or for the federal firearms charges. So those are the cases that I wanted to talk about today. I want to thank everybody for being here. Just remember, make sure you follow us and subscribe to the channel on Cops and Cons TV. If you want to follow me on YouTube or TikTok, it's at Police Law News. And I hope that everybody has a great weekend. Thanks.